van was already rolling through the Bronx when the cold started leaking in. Doors locked tight, familiar voices asking regular questions that suddenly sounded misplaced. Nothing felt rushed during that ride, which made the calm heavier, since trust had already been spent earlier, long before tires touched that road. The drive felt routine on the surface, like business handled 100 times before, even though something underneath had quietly crossed a point of no return. Whatever happened next did not begin inside that vehicle, since the ending had been shaped years earlier, back when nobody thought money could rewrite loyalty. Long before Harlem learned to say his name with weight, the neighborhood itself was already doing the teaching, especially during the late 1970s, when survival shaped daily habits. Buildings leaned tired, jobs disappeared quietly, schools struggled to hold attention, while corners stayed busy with older faces explaining how cash really moved locally. For kids growing up there, understanding transactions came early, since every block had visible rules about who paid, who watched, and who stayed standing. Nothing about learning those lessons felt dramatic or reckless at the time, since the environment treated them as basic knowledge passed down without ceremony. Richard Porter came up inside that atmosphere. Born in Harlem on July 26, 1965, carrying responsibility early as the oldest child in the household, always balancing shortages. His mother, Velma Porter, worked to keep stability, while Rich learned quickly that protecting younger siblings meant staying aware of everything happening nearby. By the time he reached middle school age, the idea of earning on the street did not feel criminal to him, since it looked practical within that setting. Selling early never registered as rebellion, since older kids already treated it as a standard step rather than a dangerous leap. During those years, the late 1970s, sliding into the early 1980s, Harlem's street economy moved with a consistency that rewarded reliability more than loud behavior. Rich did not build attention through threats or random aggression, since his presence stayed steady, his timing stayed sharp, and his words stayed dependable. People remembered faces that showed up daily without drama, which helped him blend into corners without drawing unnecessary focus from police or rivals. That approach allowed trust to grow quietly, creating relationships based on delivery rather than intimidation. Selling at a young age during that era rarely brought shock from neighbors, since many adults already understood how limited legitimate pathways had become. Older hustlers watched kids closely, testing patience, memory, and respect, while removing anyone who moved sloppy or attracted trouble. Rich passed those informal tests early, since he listened more than he spoke and avoided flashy habits that brought heat. Over time, that discipline separated him from others who chased fast attention without thinking through consequences. By the early 1980s, before crack fully rewired Harlem's pace, Rich was already known as reliable rather than reckless, which mattered more than volume back then. He learned which buildings tolerated activity, which superintendents looked away, and which blocks demanded careful timing. That knowledge came from observation instead of confrontation, allowing him to move without shaking the environment unnecessarily. People trusted him with small responsibilities first, then gradually with larger expectations tied to money movement. Violence did not define his early reputation, which helped him operate longer than others who burned bright and disappeared fast. Consistency earned him access, while discretion earned him protection from unnecessary conflict. Even rivals understood that Rich handled business quietly, which reduced friction across shared spaces. That balance allowed him to operate without drawing lines that forced constant defense. By the time the early 1980s settled in, Harlem already felt the pressure of change coming, though few understood how fast it would arrive. Powder cocaine circulated quietly, setting the stage for something louder, quicker, and far more profitable. Rich stood positioned to adapt, since his foundation rested on method rather than impulse. That groundwork mattered later, when opportunity exploded and mistakes started costing lives instead of pride. Long before Flash entered the picture, Rich moved with awareness shaped by scarcity, obligation, and observation learned during childhood years spent watching adults struggle. Those lessons taught him how to read rooms, manage people, and pace ambition without attracting immediate consequences. By the time money finally had a name attached to it, his habits were already locked in. Nothing about his rise came from sudden brilliance, since it grew from patience formed long before Harlem started counting crack money. By the mid-80s, Harlem shifted in a way people still talk about carefully, since heroin's slow rhythm got replaced by something that moved too fast to control. Powder cocaine had already been around, but crack changed timing, scale, and pressure, since transactions now happened every few minutes instead of spaced-out exchanges. Blocks that once cooled down at night stayed active until sunrise, since demand never really paused once crack hit full circulation. That speed altered thinking across the neighborhood, since patience stopped paying while quick decisions suddenly controlled survival. Heroin money used to circulate in wider loops, moving from dealer to user, then back again over days or weeks, which allowed mistakes to hide longer. Crack tightened those loops, forcing cash to flip constantly, since sellers needed a fresh supply every single day to keep corners alive. Profits multiplied quickly, but errors also surfaced faster, leaving little room to recover from bad moves. Harlem adjusted by rewarding those who could keep pace without slipping, while removing anyone who hesitated or misread momentum. During that phase, visibility stopped being optional, since crack money brought attention whether someone wanted it or not. Wearing clean clothes, driving nicer cars, and moving confidently became signals of stability, not vanity, since customers followed strength. People trusted dealers who looked like they had control, since confidence suggested access to supply and protection. Harlem rewarded that energy openly, even while quietly watching who could maintain it without collapsing. Admiration grew alongside danger, since successful figures became symbols for possibility in a place where opportunity felt scarce. Kids watched corners closely, memorizing who stayed paid and who disappeared after making noise. Respect followed money fast, but jealousy followed even faster, since everyone saw the same success at the same time. That overlap created pressure, since staying visible meant becoming a target without realizing it immediately. Police attention shifted during this period, since crack brought violence and volume that could not be ignored. Patrols increased, investigations sharpened, and federal eyes started tracking patterns across neighborhoods. Harlem felt watched more closely than before, yet business still expanded, since money outweighed fear for many people involved. That tension forced dealers to balance growth with caution, even while crowds demanded constant presence. For someone like Richard Porter, this transition did not feel sudden, since his habits already leaned toward control rather than chaos. He understood timing, spacing, and consistency, which mattered when speed threatened to overwhelm structure. Instead of chasing every opportunity, he focused on managing flow, keeping people organized, and reducing unnecessary friction. That approach helped him adapt without drawing immediate heat, even as the environment grew louder. Crack money made reputations grow quickly, sometimes faster than understanding could catch up. Names spread across Harlem blocks without context, turning individuals into legends before they fully grasped exposure. That attention brought benefits, including easier access to supply and stronger alliances, but it also brought scrutiny from rivals and authorities. Success no longer meant safety, since standing out invited challenges from every direction. Harlem during the mid-'80s celebrated winners openly, especially those who appeared disciplined instead of reckless. People respected individuals who handled money without broadcasting desperation or insecurity. That respect translated into smoother operations, since fewer conflicts emerged when confidence was earned. Still, admiration did not stop threats from forming quietly in the background. Crack changed how time felt on the streets, since weeks started passing like days, and months felt compressed by constant activity. Decisions that once took time now happened instantly, leaving little space to correct mistakes. People adjusted by trusting instincts more than plans, which worked until pressure exposed weaknesses. That environment rewarded sharp thinkers briefly, then tested them relentlessly. Money flowing faster also meant loyalty shifted faster, since relationships formed around opportunity instead of history. Alliances built quickly, but they also fractured easily once profits dipped or rumors spread. Harlem learned to celebrate success while expecting betrayal, since both showed up together during this era. Trust became conditional, tied closely to performance rather than shared paths. By this stage, success no longer created protection, since visibility invited constant evaluation from enemies and allies alike. Standing out meant being watched, measured, and discussed across blocks without consent. That exposure forced people to move smarter, not louder, even while appearing confident publicly. Those who confused attention for safety rarely lasted long. Crack rewrote Harlem's rules by compressing everything, including money, danger, and ambition, into shorter cycles that punished hesitation. People adapted by becoming sharper or disappearing entirely. For those already grounded in discipline, the shift created opportunity alongside risk. For everyone else, it revealed how unforgiving the new pace had become. As the mid-'80s pushed forward, Harlem entered a phase where money no longer moved quietly, and neither did consequences. The neighborhood watched carefully, since every rise carried a shadow waiting to follow. Success looked powerful from a distance, but it also stripped away privacy. That reality shaped everything that followed, especially for those who learned too late that attention never equals protection. By the time crack settled into Harlem's daily rhythm, Richard Porter was no longer just another reliable seller blending into the background, since his role had quietly shifted toward coordination. He stopped touching every transaction personally, which allowed him to focus on placement, timing, and movement across multiple corners. That adjustment changed how people interacted with him, since decisions now ran through his approval instead of his hands. The transition felt natural to those around him, since Rich had already proven steady under pressure long before volume increased. Expansion did not happen through force or loud takeovers, since Rich preferred incremental growth that reduced attention while increasing reach. Corners came under his influence through relationships built on reliability rather than intimidation. He placed people where they performed best, moving them if heat built or productivity dipped. Money began flowing upward daily, not in one massive pile, but through steady accumulation that added up fast. Instead of chasing dominance, Rich focused on maintaining balance across his operation, which kept disputes low and productivity consistent. He monitored supply carefully, ensuring nobody ran dry unexpectedly, since shortages created panic and mistakes. That attention to detail earned him loyalty from those working under him, since stability meant steady income. People stayed with Rich not out of fear, but out of trust that tomorrow would still make sense. His image during this period took shape quietly, built on discipline rather than flash. While others broadcasted success immediately, Rich delayed that step, letting operations mature before lifestyle followed. When he did spend, purchases reflected confidence rather than desperation, which sent a different signal to both allies and rivals. Harlem respected that restraint, since it suggested long-term thinking instead of impulse. Generosity became part of his reputation, though it stayed measured rather than reckless. Rich helped people quietly, covering rent, supporting families, or assisting someone coming home from jail without making a public display. Those gestures strengthened bonds, but he never confused generosity with weakness. Money moved with intention, since careless spending threatened everything he built. As corners multiplied and volume increased, numbers started circulating across Harlem without official confirmation. People whispered about daily earnings, often exaggerating based on visible success and constant motion. The idea of $35K a day came from repetition rather than single windfalls, since steady flips across multiple locations added up quickly. That figure represented scale more than spectacle, grounded in consistency instead of fantasy. Rich never corrected those stories, since legends protected him as much as they exposed him. The perception of massive earnings discouraged petty challenges, since people assumed strength followed money. At the same time, he avoided behavior that would invite unnecessary attention from law enforcement. That balance kept rumors alive without triggering immediate consequences. Trust became the currency that sustained his operation, extending beyond money into loyalty and discretion. People trusted Rich with their earnings, since payouts arrived on time without manipulation. He handled disputes calmly, listening before deciding, which reduced resentment. That approach allowed his network to function smoothly, even as pressure increased. Coordination replaced chaos as the defining feature of his rise, separating him from peers who burned out fast. Rich understood that expansion required structure, not noise, which kept operations predictable under stress. When problems emerged, adjustments happened quietly, minimizing fallout. Harlem noticed that stability, which reinforced his standing further. Money moved upward daily through hands that respected process, not fear. Each corner contributed its portion, feeding a system designed to absorb pressure without collapsing. Rich positioned himself as the anchor, managing flow while others handled exposure. That separation protected him longer than most, even as attention grew. By the mid-80s, Money Rich was no longer just a nickname, since it reflected a system functioning efficiently under constant demand. His rise did not rely on sudden dominance, but on patience applied repeatedly. Harlem trusted him with money and loyalty, since he treated both as responsibilities rather than trophies. That foundation carried him forward, even as the weight of success began attracting forces he could not fully control. By the mid-80s, Harlem's cocaine flow depended less on corners and more on who controlled supply quietly, which is where Ozzy Faison entered the picture. AZ moved differently from most people on the street, since he focused on volume, logistics, and access instead of reputation. He studied prices, transportation, and demand patterns like a businessman, even while operating inside illegal lanes. People respected AZ since he stayed calm when pressure hit, which kept operations stable during sudden disruptions. AZ did not chase attention, since his priorities stayed fixed on maintaining consistent access to cocaine through Dominican connections. That role positioned him as a thinker rather than a frontline presence, which reduced exposure while increasing influence. He handled negotiations carefully, avoiding unnecessary conflict that could disrupt the flow. Harlem understood that AZ's strength came from control, not aggression, which made him valuable to anyone building scale. Richard Porter crossed paths with AZ naturally, since Rich already had distribution muscle without a steady wholesale pipeline. Their connection worked immediately since both valued structure, discretion, and reliability over chaos. Rich needed a consistent supply to feed expanding corners, while AZ needed someone trusted to move weight efficiently. That alignment created balance, allowing both to grow without stepping on each other's priorities. The introduction of Alberto Martinez shifted that balance subtly, even before anyone fully recognized it. Alpo carried energy that filled rooms quickly, mixing charm with hunger that felt contagious. He talked fast, moved faster, and believed limits existed only for people unwilling to cross lines. That mindset attracted attention immediately, especially from younger hustlers looking for momentum. Rich brought Alpo into the circle since he saw ambition paired with loyalty, which mattered at that stage. Alpo respected Rich's standing in Harlem and treated AZ's supply role with admiration initially. The trio formed without formal agreements, since each person filled a gap that benefited the others. Their partnership grew organically, driven by complementary skills rather than forced alliances. AZ supplied weight and strategy, Rich coordinated distribution and people, while Alpo handled expansion and risk-heavy moves. That division allowed operations to stretch across Harlem and beyond without collapsing. Each person believed the others strengthened the whole, which kept egos contained early on. Success reinforced trust, since money arrived consistently and disputes stayed minimal. Alpo's hunger stood out even then, since he chased growth aggressively and talked openly about expanding into other cities. Washington, D.C. caught his interest early, since prices ran higher and competition felt less organized. AZ listened cautiously, while Rich measured potential consequences quietly. Those differences did not cause conflict yet, but they introduced subtle tension around risk tolerance. Temperament varied across the trio, though nobody framed it as a problem initially. AZ preferred patience, Rich valued control, and Alpo thrived on momentum. That contrast worked while money flowed smoothly, since results muted concerns. Still, an imbalance began forming beneath the surface, shaped by how each person responded to pressure. As operations expanded, Alpo's presence brought both opportunity and volatility. His confidence opened doors quickly, but it also attracted eyes that watched closely. Rich noticed that effect, even while benefiting from Alpo's drive. AZ maintained distance emotionally, sensing how ambition could destabilize balance if left unchecked. Despite those differences, the trio thrived through the mid-'80s, building one of Harlem's most efficient cocaine pipelines. Their success rested on mutual benefit rather than dominance, which kept relationships functional. Each person believed the arrangement served their interests, which delayed deeper fractures. That stability, however, relied heavily on AZ's steady presence. AZ acted as a buffer without announcing it, absorbing tension before it reached others. His calm responses during setbacks prevented impulsive reactions that could spiral. Rich leaned on that stability, while Alpo pushed boundaries, knowing AZ often smoothed fallout. That dynamic worked until external pressure forced changes none of them fully anticipated. By late in the late 80s, the trio's reputation stretched beyond Harlem, drawing attention from both allies and threats. Money increased, but so did scrutiny, forcing constant adjustment. The partnership still held, though strain quietly accumulated. What looked solid from the outside depended more on balance than people realized. As their operation expanded, law enforcement attention intensified across Harlem, even without directly targeting Richard Porter initially. Police units tracked patterns, monitored movement, and gathered intelligence on large-scale distribution networks. Crack brought federal interest that heroin rarely triggered, shifting enforcement priorities dramatically. That environment forced dealers to operate with heightened awareness, since surveillance increased steadily. Stick-up crews also multiplied during this period, hunting big names rumored to store cash or product nearby. Robbery became organized, targeting people known for volume rather than noise. Word traveled fast about who moved weight, creating danger separate from police pressure. That threat required adjustments in storage, transportation, and personal routines. AZ understood those risks clearly, since suppliers attracted predators from multiple directions. He emphasized caution, advising against unnecessary exposure that could invite violence. Rich implemented changes quietly, tightening operations without disrupting flow. Alpo reacted differently, often viewing threats as challenges rather than warnings. The robbery attempt against AZ in August 1987 marked a turning point that changed everything. Armed intruders invaded a Bronx stash location, leading to a violent shootout that left multiple people dead. AZ suffered 9 gunshot wounds during that incident, barely surviving after emergency intervention. That moment shattered the illusion of control, showing how exposed even careful operators could become. AZ's survival did not erase the psychological impact of that attack. He recognized how quickly loyalty could fracture under pressure, especially when money involved betrayal. Recovery forced reflection, since the risk now extended beyond business into personal survival. That realization altered his relationship with the street permanently. Fear entered the operation quietly after that incident. Even though money kept moving, conversations shifted, trust tightened, and contingency plans replaced optimism. Rich absorbed the lesson, reinforcing discipline across his network. Alpo processed it differently, becoming more guarded while still chasing expansion. AZ's decision to step back followed naturally, driven by survival rather than fear. He reduced direct involvement, focusing on recovery and long-term thinking. That withdrawal removed a stabilizing force the operation depended on heavily. Without AZ's calm presence, the balance shifted noticeably. Rich attempted to compensate by tightening coordination, but AZ's absence changed the dynamics irreversibly. Decisions took longer, since caution replaced instinctive judgment. Alpo felt constrained, interpreting restraint as limitation rather than protection. That difference widened the gaps already forming beneath success. The operation continued functioning, but cracks appeared more frequently. External threats forced constant vigilance, draining energy previously spent on growth. AZ's voice, once moderating risk, now echoed faintly through secondhand advice. The trio no longer operated as a complete unit, even though money still flowed. Fear did not announce itself loudly, since nobody admitted vulnerability openly. Instead, it shaped choices subtly, influencing movement, trust, and communication. Rich felt that pressure most, since responsibility rested heavily on his coordination role. Alpo pushed forward regardless, believing momentum mattered more than caution. Law enforcement pressure intensified further, with investigations expanding across boroughs and into federal territory. Harlem felt smaller under that scrutiny, forcing operations to adapt constantly. Stick-up crews continued circling, watching for weakness. Success now attracted predators faster than protection. AZ's absence removed the buffer that once absorbed shocks quietly. Without that stabilizing influence, every decision carried heavier consequences. Rich adjusted by becoming more cautious, while Alpo leaned into risk. That divergence marked the beginning of a deeper fracture that money alone could not repair. By the late 80s, the operation stood at a crossroads, shaped by survival instincts rather than ambition. External pressure had rewritten priorities, forcing choices none of them had anticipated earlier. What once felt unstoppable now required constant defense. The predators circling ensured nothing would remain unchanged for long. By the late 80s, Richard Porter stayed planted in Harlem, focusing on keeping local operations tight, while pressure kept rising around familiar blocks. He knew which corners still held rhythm, which buildings needed cooling, and which people required repositioning to avoid unnecessary attention. That rooted approach came from understanding that Harlem rewarded consistency over sudden expansion during moments of heightened scrutiny. Staying local allowed Rich to monitor everything closely, even as money continued cycling upward daily. Alpo Martinez moved differently during that same period, since his ambition stretched beyond Harlem's compressed landscape toward wider territory. Washington, D.C. pulled his interest early, offering higher prices, looser organization, and faster accumulation for those willing to move boldly. Alpo traveled frequently, building contacts and testing new lanes without fully looping Rich into every detail. That outward movement created distance, even though the partnership technically remained intact. Money started flowing through separate channels, changing how information moved between them. Rich handled Harlem-based revenue predictably, tracking numbers through familiar hands and routines. Alpo's earnings came back less regularly, sometimes arriving in bursts rather than steady patterns. That difference complicated accounting, since clarity depended on communication that slowly weakened over time. Information lagged behind money, which created a subtle tension that neither addressed openly. Rich noticed shifts without confirmation, sensing gaps where transparency once lived. Alpo assumed trust covered those spaces, believing results mattered more than explanations. That mismatch allowed uncertainty to grow quietly, feeding assumptions instead of conversations. Small business tensions formed around pricing, sourcing, and margins, though nobody framed them as disputes directly. Rich focused on protecting the structure, while Alpo chased opportunity wherever it surfaced. Each believed their approach served the partnership best, even though priorities increasingly diverged. That silent disagreement stayed buried under continued profits. Trust became assumed rather than checked, which altered decision-making subtly but significantly. Earlier, questions flowed freely, clarifying moves before consequences landed. Now, silence filled gaps once occupied by confirmation. That shift did not cause immediate damage, but it weakened safeguards that previously prevented misunderstandings. Harlem operations demanded caution, especially with law enforcement pressure lingering nearby. Rich tightened routines, reduced exposure, and adjusted staffing carefully. Alpo's external moves required flexibility, improvisation, and rapid decisions. Those contrasting environments shaped their instincts differently, pushing them further apart without confrontation. Communication narrowed as schedules diverged, reducing opportunities for alignment. Rich expected updates that arrived late or partially. Alpo believed independence demonstrated strength rather than disrespect. Both interpretations felt reasonable individually, yet incompatible collectively. Money masked the growing divide, since profits continued validating each approach. Success softened concerns temporarily, encouraging postponement of difficult discussions. That delay allowed assumptions to harden into beliefs. Once trust shifted from active maintenance to passive expectation, cracks widened naturally. The partnership still functioned outwardly, though internally, it operated on momentum rather than clarity. Rich felt responsibility intensify, since Harlem's stability depended on his coordination. Alpo felt constrained by caution, interpreting restraint as limitation instead of protection. Those perspectives never collided directly, but they drifted apart steadily. DC represented a possibility for Alpo, while Harlem represented an obligation for Rich. Neither viewpoint outweighed the other objectively, yet both demanded commitment. Balancing those demands required communication that no longer flowed smoothly. The absence of explicit conflict masked deeper misalignment. Trust, once reinforced through shared routines, now relied on past success as proof. That reliance weakened oversight, allowing doubt to linger unchallenged. Rich noticed changes but avoided pressing, valuing peace over confrontation. Alpo pushed forward, assuming silence meant approval rather than concern. By the end of that period, the partnership rested on habits formed earlier, not conditions currently unfolding. Money traveled faster than understanding, widening gaps quietly. What once felt synchronized now moved on separate clocks. That difference set the stage for consequences neither anticipated fully. Donald Porter disappeared on December 5, 1989, during a regular school morning that should have ended like every other weekday in Harlem. He left home heading toward PS 92 near West 134th Street, carrying nothing that suggested danger or urgency. The walk was familiar, short, and repeated countless times, which made the absence feel wrong almost immediately. By early afternoon, concerns shifted into panic once the school confirmed Donald never arrived that morning. Velma Porter started retracing steps quickly, asking neighbors, store owners, and adults posted near corners whether they had seen her son pass by. Nobody reported anything unusual, which deepened fear instead of calming it. Around 4 p.m., the phone rang inside the Porter home, changing the day permanently. Donald's voice came through briefly, shaking and scared, before the line disconnected without explanation. That call confirmed the disappearance was not random, since someone else controlled the situation already. Later that night, another call came, this time from a man who spoke with authority and restraint. He warned Velma against contacting the police, stating consequences plainly without emotional spikes. The demand followed shortly afterward, setting a ransom at $500,000, a number chosen deliberately to reflect inside knowledge. The demand alone revealed the kidnapping was targeted, not opportunistic, since the caller clearly understood Rich Porter's financial position. No street crew snatched a child without information, planning, and expectation. The figure communicated confidence, implying patience backed by leverage. The family realized immediately that this was not bluffing or confusion, but a calculated move. The next day, the kidnappers requested to speak directly with Richard Porter, shifting pressure toward the person they believed controlled the resolution. Rich took the call, trying to maintain composure while absorbing the reality forming around him. The ransom dropped to $350,000, signaling negotiation rather than mercy. Instructions followed, directing Rich to a McDonald's on 125th Street and Broadway to retrieve further guidance. Rich sent someone else instead, avoiding unnecessary risk while following instructions carefully. Under the bathroom sink, the messenger found a coffee cup holding items meant to erase doubt. Inside sat a severed fingertip and 2 rings Donald always wore, leaving no ambiguity about the seriousness. A cassette tape accompanied the items, adding another layer of control. The tape contained Donald's voice, recorded under distress, pleading for help and describing the pain inflicted already. He begged for compliance, naming family members, expressing fear, and repeating instructions given to him. The delivery transformed the kidnapping into psychological warfare, applying pressure beyond money into emotional collapse. Rich and his family listened, knowing refusal now carried irreversible consequences. The calls escalated afterward, shifting tone from negotiation to intimidation. Rich explained the difficulty of raising the full amount immediately, offering $200,000 while promising more soon. The kidnappers rejected partial payment, insisting on full compliance without delay. Communication paused afterward, leaving the family suspended between action and silence. Rich entered a private conflict that few understood, balancing instinct, responsibility, and rage without clear direction. Paying the ransom felt necessary to save Donald, yet uncertainty lingered about whether compliance guaranteed return. Street instincts warned that payment might invite further demands or permanent loss. Hunting answers felt tempting, but time pressed heavily against investigation. Throughout those days, Rich moved constantly, converting assets, calling contacts, and attempting to gather reliable information quietly. He leaned on people he trusted, asking questions indirectly to avoid alerting kidnappers. Every move carried risk, since visibility could endanger Donald further. The pressure compressed time, forcing decisions without confirmation. Unknown to Rich, the betrayal originated closer than suspicion allowed him to imagine. His uncle, Johnny Porter, played a role hidden behind family trust and distance. Johnny's involvement stayed invisible during this stage, masked by normal interactions and long-standing familiarity. Rich never suspected blood, focusing attention outward instead. The streets reacted differently from the family, revealing a collision between moral systems operating simultaneously. Among hustlers, kidnapping a child crossed lines rarely breached, triggering quiet outrage. Words circulated carefully, condemning whoever authorized such tactics. Even in a ruthless environment, harming a kid violated understood boundaries. Street figures discussed retaliation hypothetically, speculating about consequences if identities surfaced. That anger existed separate from family grief, rooted in codes rather than love. The family experienced terror, while the streets experienced violation of order. Those reactions never aligned fully, exposing gaps between emotional loss and structural offense. Rich straddled both worlds, feeling responsibility to family while navigating street logic simultaneously. He understood retaliation could complicate negotiations, yet passivity felt equally dangerous. Every call delayed resolution while increasing anxiety. Sleep disappeared as days blended together without clarity. A note arrived days later, delivered by a child, stating Donald needed medical attention and time was limited. The message reignited urgency without providing direction, intensifying helplessness. Police involvement became unavoidable as silence extended, though the decision weighed heavily. Rich knew law enforcement presence could provoke kidnappers into irreversible action. Once authorities became involved quietly, the investigation began without publicity, aiming to protect Donald's life. Federal agents joined local detectives, mapping connections and tracking patterns. Still, progress moved slowly compared to the ticking clock imposed by kidnappers. The family waited while fear deepened. Rich's internal debate intensified, swinging between compliance and defiance as options narrowed. Paying might save Donald, yet uncertainty undermined confidence. Refusing payment risked immediate harm, but retaliation promised justice without assurance of recovery. Each path carried an irreversible cost. During this period, Rich reportedly received assistance from Richard Fritz Simmons, a known wholesaler respected across Harlem. Fritz allegedly provided product on consignment, allowing Rich to generate ransom funds quickly. That gesture reflected shared outrage rather than business interest. The streets quietly supported saving a child, even when family blood caused the danger. Despite efforts, no clear exchange materialized, leaving Rich stuck between preparation and paralysis. Communication from kidnappers slowed, creating fear that Donald's fate no longer depended on negotiation. Rumors surfaced that Rich considered refusing payment, believing compliance might not secure a return. Whether true or not, doubt shaped perception. The streets sensed escalation, watching carefully without interference. Some believed retaliation would follow discovery, while others hoped negotiation still held potential. Nobody moved openly, since missteps could end everything instantly. Silence filled spaces where clarity once lived. Uncle Johnny's role remained hidden throughout this stage, protected by proximity and trust. He moved unnoticed, leveraging familiarity to avoid suspicion. Rich never questioned him, since family bonds overshadowed doubt. That blindness allowed the situation to unfold unchecked. As December ended, hope thinned without resolution, leaving Rich emotionally fractured and exhausted. Every ring of the phone triggered anticipation and dread simultaneously. Donald's absence reshaped priorities instantly, dwarfing money, reputation, and survival instincts. The kidnapping broke every rule that once governed behavior. Two moral systems collided openly during those weeks, exposing the limits of street codes against family bonds. The streets condemned the act, yet lacked the authority to resolve it. The family suffered helplessly, unable to leverage codes or force outcomes. Rich stood between them, carrying weight from both sides. By the end of the month, nothing felt predictable anymore. Decisions once guided by experience now required guesswork under pressure. The kidnapping reshaped everything around Rich, redefining risk and loyalty permanently. What followed would emerge from this moment, whether anyone was ready or not. While Donald's disappearance consumed every waking thought inside Richard Porter's world, the business side kept moving with an uneven rhythm that nobody fully addressed. Corners still needed supply, people still expected pay, and routines demanded attention even as fear pressed from every direction. Rich handled operations defensively, tightening movement and limiting conversations to essentials. That posture protected him temporarily, though it also slowed information sharing at the exact moment clarity mattered most. Alpo Martinez watched those changes closely from a distance shaped by travel and ambition, interpreting caution through a different lens. He noticed products arriving more slowly, prices shifting subtly, and explanations thinning without direct discussion. From his perspective, withheld details suggested decisions happening without his input. That perception did not arrive suddenly, since it formed through repeated gaps rather than a single moment. The kidnapping amplified every uncertainty already lingering beneath the partnership, turning normal delays into suspicious signals. Alpo questioned whether resources were being diverted quietly to handle the crisis. He wondered if product allocations reflected shifting priorities rather than logistical strain. Those thoughts grew privately, fed by silence instead of confirmation. Rich operated under emotional fracture during this period, balancing fear for his brother against responsibility for a network that depended on stability. He limited exposure, avoided unnecessary meetings, and leaned on fewer voices than before. That contraction made sense under pressure, yet it also reduced transparency unintentionally. People around him felt the shift without understanding the cause fully. Communication slowed noticeably, creating space for assumptions to replace dialogue. Alpo interpreted silence as exclusion, while Rich viewed distance as protection. Neither explanation surfaced openly, since both believed restraint prevented escalation. That mutual caution hardened into misalignment quietly. Business tensions overlapped the kidnapping crisis without colliding directly, creating parallel stress lines that weakened trust incrementally. Money flowed unevenly, complicating expectations shaped by earlier consistency. Rich prioritized safety and control, while Alpo prioritized momentum and expansion. Each approach felt necessary from its own viewpoint, yet incompatible when combined. Alpo's suspicions centered around product flow and pricing adjustments that lacked explanation. He questioned whether Rich limited access deliberately or simply reacted to pressure poorly. Without confirmation, speculation filled the void, coloring interpretations of every delay. That internal narrative gained weight through repetition rather than evidence. Rich sensed tension indirectly, noticing changes in tone and responsiveness without knowing their source. He avoided confrontation, believing focus belonged on Donald's recovery rather than business disputes. That decision preserved emotional bandwidth temporarily, though it postponed necessary alignment. Silence seemed safer than confrontation under those circumstances. The streets continued operating around them, indifferent to internal fractures, yet sensitive to instability. Rumors circulated lightly, hinting at strain without specifics. Observers noticed changes in rhythm without understanding the cause. That ambient awareness increased pressure quietly. Alpo's outward confidence masked growing unease about control and information access. He prided himself on understanding numbers and movement, yet recent patterns felt opaque. The lack of direct answers fed frustration rather than clarity. Trust shifted subtly from active belief to conditional acceptance. Rich leaned inward, relying on familiar structures to maintain order during chaos. He assumed shared history would carry understanding without constant explanation. That assumption underestimated how distance reshapes perception. What once felt obvious now required articulation, neither provided. Assumptions replaced verification as time passed, widening gaps through interpretation alone. Alpo assumed decisions hid intent, while Rich assumed patience communicated necessity. Neither assumption reflected the other's reality accurately. That mismatch created emotional distance without explicit conflict. The kidnapping intensified urgency around money, since every delay felt dangerous. Business disagreements became inseparable from personal crises, even without acknowledgement. Alpo questioned whether priorities aligned anymore. Rich questioned whether exposure risk outweighed expansion. No single argument marked the shift, since change occurred through accumulation. Each unspoken thought layered onto previous doubts, creating narratives without challenge. That process did not guarantee betrayal, yet it created conditions where betrayal became conceivable. The ground shifted quietly beneath long-standing trusts. Both men continued functioning outwardly, maintaining appearances shaped by habit. Internally, alignment weakened as pressures pulled focus in opposite directions. The fire burning inside Rich demanded attention, while another ignited quietly between partners. Neither fully recognized how close those flames moved toward the intersection. As days passed, the gap widened through continued silence, feeding interpretations neither intended to create. Trust survived, though it no longer felt reinforced actively. The partnership drifted without collapse, carried by momentum rather than agreement. That drift set the stage for choices shaped by misunderstanding rather than necessity. Nothing at this stage made betrayal unavoidable, since outcomes still depended on communication and clarity. Yet silence carried weight, influencing decisions subtly. When trust becomes assumed instead of maintained, cracks form naturally. The situation moved forward, shaped by that truth, whether acknowledged or not. The meeting came together the same way dozens before it had, framed as ordinary coordination meant to clean up loose business while pressure stayed high elsewhere. Richard Porter treated it as maintenance, expecting discussion around numbers, movement, and how recent disruptions affected flow. Familiar voices handled the call, calm and unforced, which fit the pattern everyone recognized. Nothing about the timing or wording suggested urgency, danger, or a break from established routine. That sense of normal carried into the movement itself, since routes stayed familiar and schedules followed habits built over years. Rich approached it tired rather than suspicious, shaped by weeks of emotional strain tied to his brother's disappearance. Routine offered stability during chaos, which lowered defenses naturally without conscious decision. Predictability felt safer than improvisation in that moment. The van ride began quietly, rolling through the Bronx with traffic moving steadily and no visible tension inside. Conversation stayed light, circling neutral topics instead of unresolved issues that weighed on everyone privately. Laughter surfaced briefly, not forced, reflecting shared history more than trust renewed. That ease felt earned through repetition, masking undercurrents nobody addressed directly. Gary Terrell's presence did not raise concern, since he occupied space the way he always had, familiar and unassertive. He did not steer the conversation or signal urgency, blending into the background of movement and talk. His role appeared functional rather than directive, part of the environment rather than the focus. Nothing about his demeanor suggested preparation beyond participation. As the vehicle continued, Rich focused on the next steps, mentally organizing decisions waiting once the kidnapping situation broke open. He expected the discussion to deepen after arrival, believing context would guide the conversation naturally. Silence filled gaps comfortably, reinforcing the idea that nothing required immediate scrutiny. That assumption rested on years of similar moments, ending without incident. The collapse arrived without buildup, not through argument or raised voices, but through sudden action that erased explanation instantly. Trust did not fracture gradually, since control vanished faster than reaction could form. There was no warning exchange or clarifying statement preceding the shift. Routine evaporated within seconds, replaced by finality. The act itself stayed contained and efficient, lacking spectacle or prolonged struggle. No speech explained motive, and no emotion guided movement in that space. Preparation shaped the outcome rather than impulse, reflecting a decision already settled elsewhere. Finality replaced uncertainty immediately, leaving no room for negotiation. Rich's death happened inside that confined environment, ending motion and conversation together. Control remained tight throughout, preventing chaos or escalation. The process concluded quickly, avoiding noise or attention. There was nothing theatrical about it, only completion. Afterward, the body was left behind in the Bronx, abandoned without ceremony or concealment. That choice communicated separation rather than confusion, marking an endpoint without commentary. Leaving him there removed responsibility from the moment, shifting consequence outward toward discovery. The location carried weight through absence rather than the message. Alpo Martinez did not linger, since movement mattered more than reflection at that stage. He headed south shortly afterward, toward Washington, D.C., using distance as insulation from the immediate aftermath. Departure replaced presence as a survival strategy, creating separation without closure. That movement registered quickly among those paying attention. Word traveled fast through Harlem, spreading confusion before facts settled. People struggled to reconcile routine expectations with irreversible outcomes, searching memory for missed signals. Speculation filled gaps while verified information surfaced slowly. Shock replaced certainty across blocks accustomed to Rich's steady presence. The streets reacted quietly, processing loss through silence rather than celebration. Many questioned how a normal business turned fatal without warning. Conversations focused on trust and proximity more than money. Absence felt heavier than noise during those first days. Law enforcement responded after the discovery, beginning an investigation without immediate clarity. Attention turned toward connections, timing, and movement patterns surrounding that day. Official processes moved more slowly than street understanding, leaving space for rumor. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Alpo's disappearance registered quickly, amplifying suspicion without confirmation. People noticed absence more than presence, connecting dots cautiously. Some interpreted the move as calculation, while others read fear into distance. Meaning shifted depending on perspective and loyalty. The setup succeeded through familiarity rather than deception, using a routine built across years as cover. Trust collapsed quietly, leaving no dramatic residue behind. What remained was absence, unanswered questions, and a body-marking finality. That ending resolved nothing beyond one life taken. Rich Porter's death closed a chapter abruptly, while opening others filled with consequence. The body left behind became a symbol rather than a statement, carrying weight through silence. Alpo's movement south created distance without explanation or resolution. Everything that followed grew from that moment, shaped by the aftermath rather than intent. Richard Porter's body was discovered in the Bronx shortly after he was left behind, drawing attention before clarity could settle. Early assumptions spread fast, shaped by disbelief more than evidence, as people struggled to align routine movement with sudden finality. Some believed robbery went wrong. Others whispered internal conflict, while many stayed quiet, waiting for confirmation. The location itself fueled speculation, since it sat outside Rich's usual orbit, suggesting movement with purpose rather than chance. News reached Harlem quickly, traveling through phones, corners, and closed-door conversations, each version carrying a slight variation. Shock hit first, freezing reactions across blocks where Rich's presence once anchored routine. People gathered quietly, replaying recent interactions, searching memory for signs that never registered as warnings. That confusion lingered, refusing to resolve into understanding. Donald Porter remained missing during those first days, creating a tension that refused closure. Harlem processed Rich's death while holding unanswered fear about a child still absent. The overlap felt unnatural, forcing grief and hope to exist together without separation. Every update about Rich intensified urgency around Donald, since time now carried a heavier weight. Velma Porter moved through those days suspended between mourning and vigilance, unable to settle into either fully. The loss of one son collided with uncertainty surrounding the other, stretching endurance thin. Family members avoided final rituals, hoping Donald might still return. That hope prevented grief from stabilizing, leaving everything unresolved. The streets responded cautiously, recognizing the collision of codes and reality unfolding publicly. Many respected Rich deeply, which made silence the dominant reaction rather than spectacle. Conversations stayed contained, avoiding speculation that could invite further harm. That restraint reflected awareness that this situation crossed familiar boundaries. As shock faded, dread settled in quietly, replacing disbelief with a heavier understanding. People began accepting that Rich was gone permanently, while Donald's fate remained uncertain. That realization darkened conversations, shifting tone from confusion to fear. The possibility that both brothers might be lost felt unbearable to articulate openly. Law enforcement began connecting separate threads cautiously, examining Rich's death alongside the kidnapping investigation. Detectives compared timelines, communications, and movements surrounding both incidents. Patterns emerged slowly, suggesting proximity between events rather than coincidence. Still, confirmation lagged behind suspicion. Authorities recognized that Rich's death complicated negotiation possibilities, altering assumptions about Donald's safety. The disappearance now carried additional danger since leverage shifted unpredictably. Investigators adjusted their approach, balancing urgency with restraint. Each decision risked accelerating consequences without control. The emotional weight of Rich dying without knowing his brother's fate pressed heavily on those closest to him. That unresolved connection shaped grief differently, adding layers beyond loss alone. Friends spoke quietly about unfinished conversations, promises unkept, and responsibilities left hanging. The absence felt incomplete rather than final. Harlem's atmosphere shifted noticeably, As everyday movement slowed under collective unease, corners felt quieter, conversations shorter, eyes more alert. People sensed something unresolved lingering beneath the surface. That awareness altered behavior subtly across familiar spaces. Rumors circulated cautiously, naming possibilities without commitment. Some suspected internal betrayal, others pointed outward toward unknown actors. No narrative settled firmly since evidence remained incomplete. Uncertainty ruled discussions, preventing closure. Donald's absence became the focal point of lingering hope and fear combined. Each passing day stretched patience thinner, intensifying emotional strain. Families avoided assumptions, clinging to possibility despite growing dread. That tension kept grief suspended, neither fully expressed nor resolved. Law enforcement pressure increased quietly, expanding surveillance and questioning across networks connected to Rich. Investigators traced communications, financial movement, and relationships carefully. Each discovery raised more questions than answers. Progress moved more slowly than anxiety demanded. The streets watched cautiously, aware that investigations could provoke reactions from hidden players. Silence became protective, limiting exposure while waiting for clarity. That restraint reflected an understanding of how quickly situations escalated under pressure. Nobody wanted to trigger irreversible outcomes. As days passed, the reality of Rich's death settled deeper, reshaping perception permanently. People accepted loss intellectually, though emotionally it remained unfinished. Donald's fate hung unresolved, preventing closure. The story refused to conclude, holding everyone suspended. Two bodies framed the narrative, one confirmed, one absent, bound together by unanswered questions. Harlem carried both realities simultaneously, struggling to process either fully. The weight of uncertainty pressed heavier than grief alone. What followed would depend on revelations still hidden. Alpo Martinez's arrest did not arrive suddenly, since pressure had been building quietly across jurisdictions following Richard Porter's death and the unresolved kidnapping. Federal agents tracked movement, communications, and associations, slowly tightening a net shaped by patterns rather than one mistake. When Alpo was finally taken into custody in 1991, the scope of charges reflected years of accumulated activity rather than a single incident. Murder counts from Washington, D.C. sat alongside conspiracy, narcotics trafficking, and firearms violations, forming a case too heavy to outrun. Facing that reality, Alpo evaluated survival with clarity shaped by experience, understanding the system now held leverage impossible to fight directly. Cooperation emerged not as a strategy for advantage, but as an option to remain alive long enough to matter. The decision reflected calculation rather than remorse, grounded in the knowledge that silence guaranteed a different ending. Once cooperation began, the scale of information widened quickly, exposing networks previously hidden behind loyalty and fear. Federal prosecutors outlined expectations plainly, demanding full disclosure across multiple cases without selective memory. Alpo agreed, providing testimony that extended beyond his own actions into broader operations. That cooperation redefined him publicly, shifting perception from feared hustler to government witness overnight. The transformation unsettled Harlem, since it forced confrontation with realities long avoided. As details surfaced, attention turned toward family betrayal embedded within the kidnapping. Investigators uncovered Uncle Johnny Porter's involvement, revealing how proximity enabled access without suspicion. His role centered on facilitating Donald's abduction through familiarity rather than force. That revelation stunned those closest to the family, exposing how trust created vulnerability impossible to anticipate. Preacher Heatley's name followed, tying execution to planning through cold efficiency. Heatley handled the violence directly, acting on instructions shaped by greed rather than loyalty. Together, Uncle Johnny and Heatley formed a partnership that weaponized intimacy against blood. The exposure reframed the kidnapping entirely, transforming it from an external threat to an internal collapse. Donald Porter's murder was confirmed during this period, ending months of uncertainty with devastating finality. Investigators established that he had been killed shortly after the kidnapping, contradicting hopes fueled by ransom communication. Evidence showed he was strangled and dismembered, with his remains hidden to delay discovery. That confirmation shattered remaining illusions, grounding grief in irreversible truth. The context surrounding Donald's death revealed how control replaced negotiation early in the kidnapping. Ransom demands functioned as leverage rather than a genuine exchange, designed to extract money regardless of outcome. The finger delivery and recorded pleas served intimidation rather than assurance. Understanding that sequence reframed Rich's decisions, highlighting how options narrowed before he recognized them. Court proceedings unfolded slowly, stretching pain across years instead of resolving it quickly. Uncle Johnny Porter and Preacher Heatley faced charges that carried life sentences, reflecting severity rather than spectacle. Testimony detailed betrayal step by step, stripping away myths about street honor and family protection. Convictions arrived through process rather than drama, leaving little satisfaction behind. Alpo's testimony extended beyond the kidnapping, implicating associates and outlining operations across Harlem and D.C. His cooperation dismantled multiple cases simultaneously, accelerating convictions while complicating moral judgment. People struggled to reconcile his role as both perpetrator and witness. That complexity resisted simple categorization. Harlem's reaction unfolded with exhaustion rather than outrage, shaped by years of cumulative loss. Betrayal no longer shocked, since history had conditioned people to expect collapse eventually. Conversations carried resignation more than anger, acknowledging damage without energy for protest. The community processed truth quietly, absorbing impact without spectacle. Justice arrived unevenly, resolving some questions while leaving others unanswered permanently. Rich Porter's murder case moved forward separately, resulting in convictions tied to the van shooting. Still, the sequence of events never formed a clean narrative, since timing and motive remained layered. Closure felt partial, shaped by legal outcomes rather than emotional resolution. Families navigated courtrooms carrying grief compounded by public exposure. Testimony forced repetition of trauma, reopening wounds under fluorescent lights. Each appearance extended suffering, stretching healing thin. Justice demanded endurance rather than relief. The confirmation that Rich died without knowing Donald's fate weighed heavily during proceedings. That reality reframed testimony, underscoring unfinished responsibility and broken timelines. Friends reflected on conversations left unresolved, decisions cut short, and obligations transferred abruptly. Loss felt incomplete rather than concluded. Alpo entered witness protection after sentencing, relocating under government supervision. That move removed him physically, though his name lingered heavily in memory. Cooperation ensured survival, though it isolated him permanently from familiar spaces. Distance replaced belonging, carrying consequences without redemption. The courts closed cases gradually, issuing sentences that reflected law rather than balance. Life terms landed where betrayal demanded accountability, while cooperation mitigated others. Outcomes satisfied legal frameworks without soothing communal wounds. Justice functioned, though unevenly. Harlem adjusted to the truths revealed, absorbing them into collective memory without ceremony. Stories shifted tone, replacing speculation with confirmed detail. Acceptance followed slowly, shaped by fatigue rather than forgiveness. The community moved forward, carrying lessons learned without celebration. The uncomfortable truths forced recognition that danger often hides closest, disguised by familiarity and trust. Loyalty fractured not from rivalry, but from greed operating quietly within. That understanding reshaped how people assessed risk afterward. The story ended legally, though emotionally unresolved. What remained was a ledger of outcomes. Some delivered, others delayed beyond usefulness. After the money stopped circulating and the courtrooms emptied, Richard Porter stopped existing as a presence and became a memory shaped by repetition. People stopped describing his movements and started referencing his name as shorthand for a moment in Harlem history. Stories condensed over time, trimming nuance until only outlines remained. That shift did not happen maliciously, since memory naturally favors clarity over complexity when details grow heavy. Rich became remembered less for method and more for outcome, which flattened the structure he actually built. The patience, restraint, and coordination that defined his rise faded behind simplified labels. People spoke about money totals without explaining repetition or scale. The process disappeared while the results stayed visible. Legends formed quietly, shaped by retelling rather than record. Each version emphasized different traits, depending on who spoke and why. Some highlighted generosity, others focused on reach, while many skipped contradictions entirely. Complexity felt inconvenient once time passed, making simplified narratives easier to carry. The movie Paid in Full accelerated that flattening, introducing a visual shorthand that replaced layered reality for many viewers. Characters inspired by real people absorbed fictional traits that blurred boundaries between fact and dramatization. Rich's image merged with portrayal, creating expectations shaped by cinema rather than history. That influence reshaped perception permanently, especially for those too young to remember the era firsthand. Paid in Full did not invent the story, but it reorganized it into a digestible form. The film emphasized emotion and conflict while compressing timelines aggressively. Nuanced decisions became dramatic pivots, altering how motivations appeared. That shift made the story accessible, though less accurate. People began referencing scenes instead of events, quoting dialogue rather than testimony. That transition changed how Rich was discussed in casual conversation. Fiction started guiding memory, replacing lived experience gradually. The legend became cleaner than reality ever was. Alpo Martinez's path after cooperation followed a quieter arc, shaped by distance rather than dominance. Witness protection removed him from familiar environments, forcing anonymity where recognition once defined survival. Years passed without spectacle, marked by movement rather than presence. The streets he left behind continued without him. When Alpo eventually returned to Harlem after release, the reception lacked celebration or outrage. People noticed quietly, processing return through exhaustion rather than reaction. Time had diluted intensity, leaving curiosity instead of anger. His presence felt like an echo rather than a disruption. Alpo's death in 2021 arrived without ceremony, ending his story quickly on a Harlem street. The shooting did not carry symbolic framing or public spectacle. News traveled briefly, then settled without prolonged attention. The ending matched exhaustion rather than drama. That conclusion did not rewrite history, since outcomes had already settled emotionally. People acknowledged it, then moved forward. No balance shifted afterward. The story simply closed one remaining door. Harlem itself remained physically unchanged in layout, carrying the same blocks, buildings, and intersections that shaped earlier movement. Streets still held memory without signage, preserving history through familiarity rather than markers. Names carried weight even when faces disappeared. Geography stayed constant while meaning evolved. Corners once known for activity now held quieter routines. Though awareness lingered, people passed through spaces layered with memory unknowingly. Time softened edges without erasing the imprint. The environment absorbed history naturally. Rich Porter's name still surfaced occasionally, spoken carefully, depending on context. Older residents remembered patterns younger ones never saw. Stories shifted tone with age, reflecting experience rather than excitement. Memory matured while remaining incomplete. The story did not end with lessons delivered explicitly, since outcomes spoke without instruction. No moral summarized events cleanly. Continuity replaced closure, reflecting how history actually functions. Life moved forward without resolving contradictions fully. Money stopped moving, but the consequence continued circulating through memory and behavior. People adjusted their instincts based on what they witnessed or heard. Caution replaced ambition for some, while others pursued opportunity differently. Influence persisted subtly. Rich remained present through absence, shaping conversation without appearing. His story influenced how trust, loyalty, and ambition were discussed afterward. Harlem absorbed that influence quietly. Nothing dramatic marked the shift. Legends continued circulating, simplified yet persistent. Reality existed beneath those stories, though harder to access. Those who lived it remembered differently from those who watched later. Time preserved fragments unevenly. The narrative closed not with resolution, but with continuation shaped by memory rather than movement. Harlem carried forward, unchanged structurally, but permanently marked by what occurred. Names still held weight even without presence. The story rested there, unfinished, yet complete.